Welcome everyone, and may I take this opportunity to wish everyone here this evening a happy new year, and I hope that you're all in good health and getting through these trying times. And we do hope, of course, that sometime this year we'll see the beginning of the end of this pandemic, and that some point in the not too distant future we'll once again be able to meet with you all and fraternize and go out together in nature like we used. So in the meanwhile, we're delighted to be continuing with our Fridays for Earth Talks 2021. This is the first of many, and just to remind you that, as usual, we will be hosting them on the second Friday of every month at this time, 7 p.m. We have a great lineup of ideas, of topics and themes, of subjects that we want to explore with you, and we will have some really interesting guest speakers, just as we do tonight. And we're really happy to invite our two guests this evening, Kevin Power and Lucy Weir, who will be formally introduced shortly by James O'Donovan, our moderator.
Thanks, Maria. So we'll play an introductory video from John Moriarty.
John Moriarty is from Moyvan in North Kerry, and he's been living a life of solitude for the last 17 years near Roundstone in Connemara. Hello, John. What are you doing here?
Digging. I did a clearing here. You know, there was a lot of bamboos here, and they died about 5 years ago. So I just cleared them and had to cut them down, and I bought them from there. You see.
You haven't always been gardening, though, have you?
No. I came. I was in the academic world for a few years, for 7 or 8 years. I taught at the University of Manitoba for 7 years, and then I dropped out and came back, and I ended up gardening. You know.
Why did you opt out?
Well, you know, when you opt out, at the time you opt out, you know, you give yourself reasons, and then having come, you know, your reasons kind of change. But do you know something, Jenna? I was even thinking about it the other day, so I could actually illustrate it for you. You know, in one way, like when I did opt out to begin with, like I said, I was seeking my bush soul. You know, I had to come away from culture, I had to come away from civilization, and come out away beyond culture, and live in wild nature again. You know, and could I maybe illustrate to you, like, if you like I could illustrate to you, you know, why I felt that, like, you know. I'll show you over here, you know. Okay. These are little rhododendrons little seedlings that grew in a formal garden over beyond the lawn, and I brought them here and put them into plastic grow bags. And you know, if you take this one, like I just put in soil here into the plastic grow bag and planted this as a Himalayan rhododendron. And in about a year's time, like, that will have sent roots right throughout the soil in here. And it will then, the roots will then hit the plastic. They will reach the limit, and they will find the plastic is dead and lifeless, and they can't get through it. So they will turn round and round and round and round, and they will go back, get introvert back into the old exhausted, astringent, sour soil, and a soil that they've already exhausted, in a sense. Now, when that happens, we talk about the plant being pot-bound, I mean, in this case, bag-bound, you know. And the thing to do then is lift the plant straight out and plant it into wild ground again. Now, at the university, like, I was teaching European culture, basically the history of European ideas, in an English department. But I had a sense, like, that European culture was itself pot-bound, that it was itself exhausted, that it was up against the plastic and the concrete of its own growing, and it had turned back into an old system, an old exhausted system of ideas, an old exhausted system of cultural axioms and assumptions. So just as I would take this plant out when it gets pot-bound and plant it in wild ground, so I want to take myself out of a culture that I thought was pot-bound, as a teacher of that, take myself out and maybe plant myself also in wild ground, in wild nature here in Connemara, you know.
When people registered for this event, we decided this time that we would try asking people who registered a question. So the question we asked was, what do you think is the cultural belief or attitude or behavior that is most supportive of our ability to live in harmony with nature and other species? And what do you think is the attitude that undermines? So we just received a couple of answers this time round. From Jury Hurtel, it's most important to understand the world, listen to science, and accept that there shouldn't be masters nor slaves. All problems can be solved by us. And what hinders was fear, and this fear being exploited. And he commented that we have nothing to lose but our chains. And then in terms of supportive attitude, another response was paganism. And in terms of an attitude that undermines, materialism, corporatism, money mania, undermines our ability to live in harmony with nature.
Okay, so I'm talking tonight on the topic of ecological compassion, and specifically on John Moriarty and interconnection with nature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some of the important biographical points of Moriarty's life, and then present 4 recurrent themes in his work that partially explain human disconnection from nature. And then I'll read 4 extracts from his autobiographical writings, which explain the need for and his experience of immersion in wild nature, and some of the tension and inner conflict he felt as regards his own impact on the environment. So just before we get into it here, everyone hearing me okay? Yeah, no problems. Great. Okay.
Before you start, Kevin, could I just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Because I realized I forgot to read out just a short introduction to Kevin, so that everybody knows where you're. Yeah, so Kevin Power has a PhD in philosophy from University College Cork. Kevin is interested in the concept of interdependence as understood in Zen Buddhism, with a particular interest in how our beliefs shape our behaviors. Over the last 2 years, he has taught ethics in UCC, University College Cork, with an emphasis on environmental concerns, and he currently lives with his wife and daughter in Castle Gregory, County Kerry. And the title of Kevin Power's presentation is Ecological Compassion.
Thanks, James. So, can we move on here? Yeah, great. So Moriarty was born in 1938 in Moyvan, Kerry. This is important in context for just to be aware that he was very aware of nature from early on. So he's rooted in a rural farming household. He's also raised within the Catholic tradition, which we'll see is fairly important also. In 1962, then he graduates with a degree in philosophy from UCD. And in that he enters into a life of learning and teaching about Western and European ideas, which we saw in the video to begin with was a very formative experience for him. So in 1965, he moves to Manitoba in Canada, and he lectures in the university there on the history of European ideas. So he enters again a life of not just learning about, but teaching and spreading the ideas of Western and European philosophy and history. In 1965, he returns to Ireland, and again, as he alluded to in the video, what he wanted to do in this case was to rediscover what he called his bush soul. So he lives often in solitude in areas like Inishbofin and Connemara, and then he moves and settles in Killarney. So his work is generally as a gardener. He gives occasional lectures and interviews, and he published 9 books before his death in 2007. And throughout Moriarty's work, then, we get themes that suggest some of the roots of disconnection from nature. And what I'm going to do when I read through the extracts is kind of highlight in his work and in his story how they come through. But to give perhaps an idea of 4 of the main ones, we have things like religious, cultural, and philosophical context. So, for example, the book of Genesis, Moriarty is brought up within the Catholic tradition, and it's the story that he's familiar with. until, as a young man, he comes across Darwin's Origin of Species, which shakes him out of his Catholic story. But given his upbringing, his Catholic upbringing, the book of Genesis obviously emphasizes that the earth is there for people to use and do what they will with. So nature and the fruits of nature are for us, and that in its own way creates a separation between ourselves and nature. He was also fascinated by, but not entirely non-critical of, Greek mythology. And in the context of what we're talking about tonight, he uses the example of Theseus and the Minotaur. So the Minotaur is this wild beast, and Theseus slays it, and in doing so makes the world a little safer for civilization. But civilization is a thing that also does great damage to nature, and Moriarty will emphasize how important wild nature and wildness actually is. We'll see that in an example in a moment. Then we have Cartesianism, which is something that Moriarty is, again, kind of fixated on in his writings and constantly coming back to. So René Descartes' philosophical project was to understand the connection between mind and matter, but that assumes that there are aspects of reality that are fundamentally different and separated from each other rather than interconnected. So Descartes' work was a major influence on the development of modern Western philosophy, and therefore did a lot to encourage the idea of dualism and separation. Then movement essential versus movement local is phraseology that Moriarty uses throughout his writing, and the best way to highlight that is to come to an example. So one of the extracts will give us an example of this. And then we have his concern about the over-reliance on commercial and technological advancement. So economic and technological development there are intimately connected, and a lot of destruction of nature in the form of roads, industry, urban centers, dams, canals, and so forth results from this. And again, a good way to highlight this is just to listen to the man himself talk about it. So the video we saw earlier on was from a little earlier in his life. This next extract is from a video you can find on YouTube with Tommy Tiernan. It's from a little bit later in his life, 2002, I believe. So if the audio is fuzzy for anyone, you can read along as I've transcribed it. And in this, he talks about his the importance of nature and wildness also.
We shape the earth to suit us. We plough it and we knock it and we shape it and we reshape it. Dolphins were land animals once, and they went down into the sea. They said to the ocean, as it were, shape me to suit you. And now the Lord saved us. I was in a house in Connemara there sometime recently, and I saw a dolphin bone. The curve of it was as beautiful as any couple of bars of Mozart's music. It was so beautiful. Like, I've no bone in my body that is shaped to the earth like that. So they said, shape us to suit you. We went the opposite way. We shaped the earth to suit us. That's going to fail. I'm just saying that shaping and reshaping, if we turn the whole earth into a Holland, we're gone. Because unless there's wildness around you, something terrible happens to the wildness inside of you. And if the wildness inside of you dies, I think you're finished.
So again, maybe just to expand on that, I'll start with this first extract from his writing. These are all autobiographical writings, so they're coming directly from him, from two books called Nostos and What the Curlew Said. So I'm going to start with an extract in which Moriarty, having just quit a very promising academic career, has returned to Ireland, and he's living in the solitude that we saw him kind of surrounded by in the video earlier on. And he has a series of transformative experiences in nature. But now, the lake still mirroring the immaculate world and mirroring me in it, I had collided with what I had become, and I felt the anguish of having to start all over again. I imagined it. I would be the mosaic maker of my own mind, and pristine sensations of the pristine world would be the tesserae. Taking my time with it, I would look at a red patch of sphagnum. Picking it from one of the wizened bushes behind me, I would taste a haw. Growing on the next rock I'd pass, I would touch a little tussock of sable moss. Without picking it, I would smell a stem of bell heather, and then, sitting by a turf fire at home, I'd listen to a curlew calling below on the shore. Starting again with sensations such as these, I'd remake my own mind. On the way back across the bog, I came to a stream that runs down into Loch Fada. Finding a place where the bank was level with the water, I knelt down and immersed my head 3 times, baptizing myself out of culture, baptizing myself out of Christianity. Thinking that I might follow to Owen Glynn all the way up into the mountains, I came to a waterfall, as much a cascade as a waterfall, and I stopped short. In the riverbed just down from the plunge pool, there was an outcrop of rock, the water rushing either side of it. I figured out how, by jumping from one to another stepping stone, I might get to it dry-shod. Finding a surface of it that was both dry and not so jagged, I sat down, well knowing that I'd be here for at least a few hours. Closing my eyes, I found myself wanting to get to know this cascade, this fall, purely through hearing. Distinguishing them from the overall roar and getting to know them individually, I attended in turn to each little rush and run. Even within the big collapse and fall of it, I found variety. As if this was nature's Eroica symphony, I got to know all the instruments and what they were doing. The waterfall in all its voices, near and far, loud and not so loud, I got to know. In the end, all awareness of the difference between subject and object in abeyance, it was to hearing itself I was listening. And what an unnaturally strange experience it was, hearing. Time was when there was no hearing in the world, but then some redundant jawbones were redesigned and put to new use, and it happened. Hearing. I listened to the strangeness. In the end, there was no me. The strangeness was listening to itself, quite without my being aware of it. There had been a transition from I am listening to listening is, from I am hearing to hearing is. Of its own accord, no active work required. It continued a long while. Then a sense of selfhood returned, and reoccupying the center, I opened my eyes now, starting all over again. I set out to get to know what was in front of me through the sense of sight. Numerous to hearing, it was equally numerous to sight. But how utterly different from each other were experiences of hearing and seeing. That long, lovely pouring there in the cascade, I will remember what it sounded like to hearing, but now experienced in seeing, what an altogether different reality it was. Returning to hearing and then coming back to my seeing many times over, I gave myself all the time I needed to live the difference. The sense that there is one world, I thought, is pure illusion. There are in fact as many worlds as there are ways of perceiving. I settled into the experience of seeing. Again, but only after a long time, the sense of selfhood slipped away. And once more there was a transition from I am seeing to seeing is. Time was when there was no seeing in the world. Then some cells became particularly light sensitive. Images appeared, and there was something marvelously new in the world. There was seeing. And how strange it was, how very strange it was. So in this experience, Moriarty was breaking out of his religious conditioning from his upbringing, as well as the intellectual conditioning of his academic life that he had lived for so long. And these were forms of conditioning that he believed were part of the problem of humans damaging the earth. And this experience represented an overcoming of the dualistic or Cartesian mode of seeing, as Moriarty went from understanding himself as part of a world intellectually to actually experiencing himself as one with it. And he did this independently and on his own. And I'd like to note as well, it seems like something that, had won the spare time, which he did. We could all try this, but it has many parallels with documented meditative experiences in traditions like Zen Buddhism. So the next extract is a little shorter, and it's just a little autobiographical note. And in it, Moriarty expresses concerns over his role as a gardener. So he's working as a gardener on an estate, and he projects this concern into a more universal point about the conflict between people and the world of which they are a part. That day, I happened to be hoeing the gravel in front of the house in Letterdyfe. It was groundsel mostly, and dandelion that kept coming through. On any reckoning, this wasn't creative gardening. It was a chore I had to undertake 3 or 4 times over the summer. Here again, I was a despoiler, getting to the plants before they had a chance to reseed both lawn and yard with their kind. I look at such a globe of seeds and I think how little of the genius that is in nature has emerged into the human mind. Looking at it, I think the extent to which we have emerged from nature is the extent to which we are merely clever. Unlike the dandelion, we have now no rhizome, no rhiza, no root down into the nourishing earth. And so the reference in that extract to humans as merely clever is an example that we could use to illustrate his differentiation between what we call movement local and movement essential. And I'm not sure if Mary McGillicuddy is on the call tonight. She wrote an excellent book called Not the Whole Story about John Moriarty. And I'd like to thank her for reminding me of this a bit after the last talk I gave this, because it's such a central notion. So we can think of movement local as progression merely through physical means. So we can think of things like the automobile, the airplane, or engineering devices that allow us to kind of plow and shape our earth. Whereas movement essential is progression through evolution of perspective, or of something more essential, a change in our essence. So in that example, on the small scale, the dandelion is doing exactly what it needs to do. It's growing in place, and Moriarty is questioning why, other than for merely cosmetic means or cosmetic wants of the owner of the land, presumably, does he actually need to move the dandelion? Then when we think about movement local, this more to what his view would be a more limited type of movement. I'll give you a large scale one, which would be the moon landing. And Moriarty references the moon landing as an example of this a couple of times in his writings. So as much as it's an impressive technical feat to land on the moon and go that far, it still imports the same kind of problematic mindset that people have sometimes with their disconnection from nature. And one example we can use of this is the fact that there is a nation's flag planted on the moon. So the idea of nationalism, the idea of one bit of land being more important than another, has now been imported to the moon by human beings. So that suggests that whilst we were able to do the local movement as he would have it in a really impressive way, there wasn't necessarily an attendant perspectival shift that suggests that there's a kind of a paradigm shift or an essential change to our species that took place because we happened to land on the moon. So for the final extract here, I'm going to talk about a period when Moriarty moved back to Kerry, and he builds a house, and he very explicitly worries about the impact that it will have on the environment. And he admits to his own inescapable hypocrisy about ecological concerns. Satisfied that a house here wouldn't damage the landscape, and assuming that I would get planning permission on it, I bought it. Permission secured, I went up one day to plant some bulbs around the place. All day long I heard loud drilling noises, and when I made inquiries, I was told that a quarry, long since idle, had been reopened across the way. It was going to be a big operation. Having come to Kerry a few weeks later to give a talk there, I looked at a site that I felt would suit me. Again, there was the business of planning permission. As soon as it was granted, I phoned Matt O'Sullivan, an auctioneer in Clifton, and I asked him to sell both my house and the site in Gorriman. The house had cost $4,500, that including the $1,500 I had eventually given to Mahal McCahill for the site. It made $40,000. The site in Gorriman had cost $4,000. It made $16,000. I paid for the site in Kerry, and expenses deducted, I had $42,000 to build a house on it with. People who had been annoyed with me because of my environmentalist campaigns I had been involved in, now they had me where they wanted me. Always with the barb and the humour, they would accuse me of being a land speculator. Among a group of us at a funeral one day, Tom Pete himself mischievously joked, he came to Connemara with nothing, and soon he'll be going away with thousands. Another day in my house, he looked at my books and said, quite a few trees knocked to keep you entertained. My response was to come out every time with my hands up. Privately, I was uneasy, and it didn't mollify my conscience to think that all of this had happened as a sequence of reactions, not by preconceived design. And to make matters worse, still hoping that something might happen between me and Eileen, I was building a 3-bedroom house in Kerry, this meaning that, if it didn't work out, then here I was wrapping £23,000 worth of the world's scarce resources around my own 4 bones. If someone called me a fraud, there was little I could do but agree. So here you see a person who's really struggling with their own sense of responsibility with regard to their local as well as their global environment. And again, he's kind of projecting his own personal experience onto the universal experience when he talks about the use of the world's resources. So even though he's had previously in his life this transformative experience in nature, which helped him overcome the dualistic aspects of his cultural conditioning, he's still a person living in a world where one needs to use resources and, in his own words, as we heard earlier, shape the earth to suit himself. So in the interconnectedness of all things, it's often not possible to do good without doing some attendant harm. I was thinking that we could actually ground this in the experience that we're all having together now, right? Because we're all gathered here presumably because we're concerned about humans damaging the planet. And yet, in order for us to connect the way we are, we have to use devices that are made from precious finite minerals that are extracted from the ground. And we have to use electricity, which is taking up a huge amount of energy. So I thought this would be a good way to segue to this conception of compassion that might be relevant to our concerns tonight. And I think Lucy might be saying a bit more about this, and I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts in the Q&A if we had time. There's a philosopher called J. Garfield who does comparative work between Western and Eastern philosophy. And he wrote a book called Engaging Buddhism and Why It Matters to Philosophy. And in it, he talks about this concept of karunya, which is a Sanskrit word, and it refers to a divine state in Theravada Buddhism. It's usually translated to English as the word compassion. And that's in large part what we're talking about here tonight. But Garfield kind of retranslates this word because he thinks the way it's being translated into English is a little bit limited. So quoting from his book, karunya connotes not just an emotive response to another, but a commitment to act on behalf of others to relieve their suffering. To cultivate care in this sense is to recognize both the omnipresence of suffering and or interconnectedness. It is to recognize that one cannot solve even the problems of one's own suffering without caring about that of others as well. So I'd suggest that those principles can and probably should be extended to our local and global environment. So because of our interconnectedness with our environment, both the human and the non-human part, we can't always have a positive impact. So this is something that you can take away tonight, or we can discuss afterwards. But it's just to think about how mindful we should be when dealing with others and when interacting with our local ecology, because we may, through our own circumstances, have maybe blind spots or failings. And I'd like to thank Lucy as well for reminding me of this in correspondence in the lead up to this talk. We were talking about the fact that in the video we watched earlier on, Moriarty was planting rhododendrons that are now considered invasive. So even in his gardening, again, he was doing something that might have been a bit destructive, even though he was involving himself with nature. And this idea that we should have humility in the face of nature at all turns. Yeah, hopefully we'll get to share some ideas on this in the Q&A or afterwards, but I just wanted to sign off by saying that it's in practical everyday actions, even though this stuff is quite philosophical, it is also quite grounded. As Garfield says, it's about action. So moving from an idea of compassion as something where you're just worried or caring about something to where you're actually acting on something. And I guess in environmental terms, that can be, on a volunteer level, it can be reflecting on your own consumption and use of resources. So with our everyday actions, we can remind ourselves to see the non-human and the human as fundamentally interconnected, and the harm of safety of one is intimately and intrinsically connected to the harm and safety of the other. So I'll hand it back over to you there, James. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks. Grateful to have Lucy with us this evening. Lucy Weir is a writer and researcher who has just published her first book, Love is Green, Compassion as Responsibility in the Ecological Emergency. In it, she discusses how there are a lot of us questioning current approaches to the ecological emergency, None so far have succeeded in altering the trajectory towards climate chaos, biodiversity loss, and mass extinction, pollution, and other symptoms of the crisis. In this book, Lucy contends that philosophical practice in this context is the active consideration of our condition, along with an effortful awareness of how conditions shape narratives and belief systems. She calls this realization as agency. This is the act of observation and self-awareness, the act of realizing our condition and our conditioning. The natural response to understanding is compassion or love, which then makes available options for action which were previously latent. The title of Lucy Weir's presentation this evening is Them and Us, Shifting Perspective on Responding to the Ecological Emergency. Okay, Lucy?
Okay, I've disappeared, but that's fine. That's my ego gone down the line. I also shared a supervisor and did my PhD under Professor Graham Parks, who Kevin did his PhD under. So we have that in common as well. And I don't plan to talk for as long as 15 minutes if I can possibly stop myself. And unfortunately, I'm also going to be reading my my text a bit. But the first thing, I suppose, I'll get this out there before we go any further, is that the idea of there being no them and us is a real challenge. I'm really interested in the practice of philosophy in response to the ecological emergency. So it's a challenge for me, and I'm proposing it. So I don't necessarily expect that it will be easy for other people to accept. It requires a radical reassessment of how one approaches situations. As you can see, I've quoted here from Mitch McConnell, who a couple of days ago said, we cannot keep drifting apart into two separate tribes, and we all know what happened next. Can we approach the ecological emergency instead of approaching it as a question of blame, judgment, increasing radicalization? Can we approach it as an emergence, an urgent and critical matter that calls for our full attention and reminds us that it is how we pay attention or realize that matters? I'm obviously not going to discuss whether or not the ecological emergency exists with this group, but I will at least clarify what I mean by the ecological emergency. And thank you very much, James, for the introduction. I use the phrase ecological emergency. It's a broader definition than most. I define the ecological emergency as encompassing both the environmental crises of pollution, deforestation, desertification, mass species extinction, and climate change, but also the human attempts to conceptualize this impact. In other words, how we see it. This linking of anthropocentric, human-caused change in both atmospheric or climate and ecological or terrestrial systems is not new, but it is also sadly uncommon as a representation in the media. In other words, the media tends to treat climate change separately from, say, extinction of species. And how we respond to this emergency isn't really considered part of that definition at all. So it's almost unheard of to take the extra step. Thank you very much for doing the slides, Alan. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. It was the philosopher Timothy Morton who came up with the phrase ecological emergency, but my definition is a bit bigger. It's not including just what is emerging externally to demand our immediate attention, whether this is storms and droughts. I'm in the Canary Islands at the moment for various reasons, and there's a massive amount of migration flow at the moment. and it's caused at least in part by these phenomena. But I also include the emergence of the awareness of our own response to this phenomena, how we respond to migrant masses and drought and increasing storms. So I also include the intersection of physical and social reality as it emerges into our awareness. And to a degree, that's what Kevin was talking about when he was talking about John Moriarty's response to culture. I don't reject culture in any way. We don't have any choice. We're in culture, but I'll come back to that. Physical reality includes ecosystem fragmentation, threatening natural systems resilience, and social reality includes attitude polarization and increased extremism. What is emerging urgently and critically in our own awareness is that these, the internal and the external, the social and the real, the us and the them, are not separate processes. They're interconnected. Indeed, the urgent emergence of our own awareness of our interconnectedness is a kind of key to how we can respond to the emergency. By realizing literally and metaphorically that we are none of us separate from either cause or response or from one another, that we're all entirely enmeshed and interconnected in the process, we can begin to consider our options. None of this is complicated. The explanation is complicated, but the actual options are not complicated, which is not to say it's easy. The next slide, please. Slide 3. My PhD research began under the late Dr. Tom Duddy in Galway in NUIG with an exploration of Paul Taylor's theory of respect for nature, which was outlined in his book of that name. And here on the screen, you will see a summary of that. My epiphany came gradually, if an epiphany can be gradual, as a result of Tom's untimely death and my having to find a new supervisor. I wanted to pause my research in order to grieve, but I had no money and I would have lost my grant. So in many respects, I had no choice. And then free will or choice became very important to my understanding of our response to the ecological emergency. Slide 4, please. I probably should have given you longer on slide 3. Respect for nature, Paul Taylor's theory, is a life-centered theory of environmental ethics. It consists of 3 interrelated components. First is the adopting of certain ultimate moral attitudes. In other words, he suggested we adopt respect for nature. Second is why should we adopt respect for nature? So it's a way of understanding the natural world and our place in it, which makes that attitude of respect appropriate to take. And third is a system of rules, moral rules and standards for guiding our treatment. So how do we actually behave when we understand our relationship with nature? The theory is structurally symmetrical with a theory of human ethics, a Kantian theory of human ethics, based on the principle of respect for persons. Kant very famously said that people should be treated as ends in themselves. Now, slide 4, if you haven't already gone on to it, you'll see how my theory of eco-philosophical theory, it's a theory of eco-philosophy, it's not an environmental ethic, how that theory kind of emerged from Paul Taylor's theory. I completed my thesis, as I said, under Professor Graham Parkes in UCC, and he encouraged me to turn from environmental ethics, which is essentially analytical philosophy, to a phenomenological understanding. Don't worry about the word, of what was going on. He introduced me to the work of Dogen Zenji, who was a 13th century Japanese Zen master and author of the Shobogenzo, the treasury of the true Dharma eye. So you can see it was quite a different approach. So my theory took Paul Taylor's theory, and instead of thinking about respect, first I thought about how can we see our species as entirely enmeshed with all other systems. I mean, actually that emerged through my research. that, you know, we are entirely enmeshed when you think about it, us as being evolved, and also us as breathing. We're not just organisms, we're also more than human, but we're also more than living. So second is the realization of what this enmeshment implies about our capacity to act as agents. I said earlier that I began to realize that I wasn't free in the way that I thought I had been. I took the radical step of saying we have no free will in the traditional sense. I told you this was challenging, and therefore we're unable to act morally in the traditional sense. So what's left? So third is understanding that the very act of realization itself is the source of our agency. So what does that mean? In Zen terms, this is the backward step. And if you just reflect for a moment right now on where you are, what you're doing, what's around you, what's brought you to this moment, then you are realizing, and realization is the backward step. That's all meditation is. You see, it's not difficult. It's very simple in essence, but it's a challenge to do all the time. So the next slide, slide 5, Dogen Zenji turned the traditional idea of working towards the Buddhist notion of enlightenment. Why is enlightenment suddenly part of this? Well, you'll, I hope, see in a moment. The Shobogenzo, all his writing is highly complex, challenging, and often paradoxical. It's mind-bendingly complex. But when you break it down, it says that we are already enlightened, all of us, human and more than human, and this is going to be a challenge. Donald Trump and Greta Thunberg, the polar ice cap, and the Sargasso Sea. What we need to do is realize this. So until you realize that you're enlightened, you can't escape the cause effect, cause effect, cause effect. And so you get behaviors like the behavior of Donald Trump. So he asked us to study to what he called practice realization, that we are all Buddha nature. But until we realize this, we cannot forget the self. And on the screen, I hope you can see this quote from Dogen Zenji, which is very close to what John Moriarty is saying, essentially. To study the Buddha, or to study the way, effectively, is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. Okay, that's rather complicated. Is it? Or is it? Or when you forget the self, do you just forget that you're separate from what's going on around you, and you begin to realize that, you know, you're the breath coming in, you're the digestion going on, you're the hearing going on, you're the listening, you're the speaking, you're all these things that are happening, and they're not atomized, they're not just happening within your skin, they're the interaction of your ongoing experience. And when you realize that, then in a sense, no trace of realization remains, because it's just listening and doing and acting. So what can you do with this information? The next slide, slide 6, shows you where I went with it. I combined the research I'd done into Taylor's respect for nature, as I said, and therefore environmental ethics, with phenomenology, evolutionary biology, systems theory, and Dogen Zenji's and other East Asian philosophies, because I also teach yoga. And it became clear to me that responding to the ecological emergency, I said earlier about the practice of adopting an attitude of respect, I would say that the practice of realization points us towards attunement to a particular attitude. And our own attitude, our own way, the how of what we do is the important thing. It's rather like shifting the focus from goals. What do we want? We want harmony. We want to live in harmony with other people, with nature. We want to be happy. We want to be loved, for instance, to means or method. So it's not the end that counts. It's how you behave right now in this moment. It's how you're sitting, how you're breathing. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a famous text used by lots of yogis and yogi philosophers, Arjuna is a warrior prince, and he's advised by his charioteer, who is actually the god Krishna, not to concern himself with the outcome. Gandhi was very keen on this, and this is Gandhi's translation. Instead, focus on your attitude, the way that you're doing what you're doing. This is rather like shifting the focus from ends to means. If the end or the goal is not something over which we have control, it is therefore not the element on which we need to focus. We don't know where this ecological emergency is going to take us, but it's not looking great. But still, it matters how you engage at every single moment that you become aware. Rather like evolution, or as I will argue, enlightenment itself, there is no goal, there is no end to it. So slide 7 takes us a bit further. It's clear that in the context of our evolutionary biology, this is a bit of a jump to a different point of the thesis, but I hope you'll bear with me. In our evolutionary biology, we Homo sapiens do not stand atop an evolutionary pyramid. Most language is metaphorical. In a sense, all language is metaphorical, and we use metaphors all the time. So for a very long time, dualistic philosophy, and you've probably seen pictures of man and then the beasts below and the angels above. Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman, and in fact, a vast number of other philosophies and ideologies and spiritual systems had this sort of ladder or pyramid imagery. It's much better, and most of you already know this, to think of evolution as a tree or a bush where viruses are on one branch and humans are on another. We're simply evolving along with everything else. If we have any quest, if evolution itself has any quest, it's to avoid annihilation. Richard Dawkins' book was basically to say, you know, that genes work to get themselves to the next generation. In other words, we're not moving towards anything, we're moving away from our own demise. Individually, of course, that doesn't make any sense at all, because we can't avoid death. It's an 100% certainty, despite people attempting to freeze themselves, that ultimately you will die. So when you consider the evolutionary push, this fact becomes important. It's further fuel for the thought that rather than concerning ourselves with personal survival, which is a fruitless task, we must consider what we might do to avoid species annihilation. And that's effectively the question of the ecological emergency. It's what emerges internally. How am I going to cope with the fact that my species is on a careening course for annihilation? And we must also consider whether the limits to our annihilation end at our own species boundary. And as I've already said, and as John Moriarty and Kevin have already said, you know, interconnectedness implies that that boundary is illusory. So Paul Taylor concluded that respect was the most reasonable attitude, and I conclude that compassion is the most reasonable attitude. When, on slide 8 now, please, Alan, when you consider most of what happens in the universe, there have been locust swarms here this year, volcanic eruptions, so-called plagues. There is an action, and then there is a reaction. And that happens from the beginning to the end of the universe. In yoga, this process is called karma. And karma doesn't have any positive or negative connotation. It simply means action. You could say there's an action and then there's another action. We generally say there's an action and then there's a reaction. Our lives are action and reaction, individually and culturally. And it in a kind of snowball effect, it tends to take us in a particular direction. But the thing that pauses us, takes us out of this process of action and reaction, is precisely the fact that we can become aware of what's going on. Realization. Realization is the process that, as soon as I draw your attention to it, you will notice how you're sitting, how you're breathing, and what is happening right now. In your own life, internally and externally, you realize. So you take what in Zen is called the backward step. You can go on to slide 9. Dogen was quite clear that there is nothing in existence which is not Buddha nature. There is no them and there is no us. This is similar to saying there is nothing that is not part of the flow of existence. Buddhism also recognizes that there is an element to this flow that is inherently compassionate. In a sense, the ground of being or existence itself is compassionate. Bear with me. Consider the universe in a Poincarean mathematical sense as a series of equations working themselves out, but then continuously not being able to quite balance, so having to continue to work themselves out. The fact that the equations of the universe, as elements in reaction or energetic systems in process, do not work themselves out in simple linear form, but instead are probabilistic, complex, and unpredictable, means that the universe itself does not simply begin at moment A and end a moment later at moment B. Otherwise, of course, we wouldn't be here. Instead, it continues through, to our minds, almost infinite time and space. And the very fact of this time and space offers all the possibilities provided by the vastness of this space and time, the possibilities for planets, stars, galaxies, and of course, ourselves, maintaining existence over time and becoming aware. Scott Sampson, by the way, has done interesting work on this, and I'll give a reference to his work. In our own case, and perhaps also in others, although we've done little research into consciousness in other creatures, it offers the possibilities provided by awareness, consciousness, and therefore realization, or in the Buddhist sense, enlightenment. There is a kind of compassion, I hope you agree with me, in this. There is more compassion in the possibility offered by existence, after all, than by non-existence. And you'll see that I've quoted something about that on the screen. Just take a breath. Only one more slide left. Okay, so slide 10. There is only one act that we can perform that creates a shift in how we relate to this existence. And this is this very act of realizing, practice realization, of becoming aware again and again, time after time, of what we're doing while we're doing it. And this is our agency. Our realization, our becoming aware of what's going on while it's going on, is our agency. Because when we practice realization, we practice realizing that we came to where we are, not because we chose to or we wanted to. I didn't choose my parents, or that my supervisor died. And the rational response to that awareness, to whether I have been kind or whether I have screwed up in response to those things, is compassion. It's a rational response to my own awareness of my own and all enmeshment. And then when compassion is elicited or attuned to, possibilities arise. It's like mindfulness. You know, you're not just triggered by the next event. You have a micro space, and in that micro space, the possibilities arise that were not there. Well, they may have been there, but they were latent, they were hidden, that you might behave differently, more kindly, for instance. You're still enmeshed, but the enmeshment has shifted. You can now see what needs to be done. And it's not as though you do it. You don't do compassion as much as compassion does you. I know that might sound a bit odd, but if you just take a breath, relax a bit, and think about being just a micro fraction kinder to yourself right now, what would it feel like? Would it mean that you relaxed your shoulders a bit more? And what would it mean if you were a little bit kinder towards the next person you met? It's not you doing it, it's you allowing the system that is cooperating with itself all the time, all your systems cooperate, to work through you. You don't act independently any more than you did before the awareness arose. But now that you're attuned to compassion, the thing that is most loving, most compassionate, does what it needs to do through you or through me. It is the attitude of all of us, even those of us who think we're on the side of the angels, that matters if we as a species are to come into alignment with the flow of the rest of existence, including living existence, so that our species can explore its potential in the fullest way possible and mitigate at least some of the impacts it has had so far, largely harmful, on the rest of the systems that created and sustain us. My suggestion is that we open to the flow of all that is going on, but realize that we don't control that flow any more than we control the flow of our thoughts or what genes we have. And by learning to do this, we'll be at a place where we're ready to take on the reality of how we can respond to what is going on, including the ecological emergency, which includes, as I have said, attitude polarization, and particularly in politics, but also in social media and public life, and possibly in your relationships with people you disagree with. If we can practice Dogen Zenji's forgetting the self and attunement to compassion, then perhaps we can think like a planet, think like a virus, think like a we. There is no end, no utopia, no perfect situation in which humanity can live with all else. There is only attunement to compassion and letting love do what needs to be done. I'm going to end there. I've got a little bit more to say, but I'm just going to finish with a quote by David Mitchell. The last line of his book, Cloud Atlas, is, "My life amounts to no more than one drop. There is so little we can do in a limitless ocean. And yet, what is any ocean but a multitude of drops?"
So we just have a few questions so far. So if anybody has some other thoughts, please put them in the chat box. So I'll start with these ones, these questions, kind of comments. I'll put these two together. If, and Kevin or Lucy, you can see if any thoughts come to mind. If we're human and alive, we are in some way part of the problem. However, if we are genuinely going lightly and working to be part of the solution, then our contribution to the problem is acceptable. And the other comment was, I used to want an electric car, but now I realize that is not a solution. A lot of our solutions are just as harmful, but just in a different way. Lucy, do you want to comment on that for starters?
I would love to, and then I'll be as brief as possible. I did promise to be brief. I didn't realize I'd gone on so much. But in my thesis, I said, you know, we can blame SUV drivers. We can blame electric car drivers. We can blame anybody else. I think that none of us, is perfect. None of us lives a perfect life. We all cause harm. It's just the nature of being alive. I mean, the most compassionate thing, probably not allowed to say this, that we could do is to shorten or even end our lives. But that wouldn't necessarily be compassionate either, because that would cause harm, grief to our relations. So we're stuck with existence. What's the kind of thing we can do? We can obviously reduce to the greatest degree possible our use of resources. But if we need to buy an electric car, buy an electric car. If we can't afford to buy an electric car, and you need a car, buy a car. And then look for ways of sharing it. Then look for ways of creating connection. Then look for ways of having a discussion, or even have a discussion first. And you might find that if you ask the question to a lot of other people, they might come up with other solutions. People want to help one another, particularly now. So let's create community, and let's create skillful communication.
Thanks. John, Kevin, maybe you could have a think about this one. John Moriarty said that we need to urgently, he said that breaking down the Berlin Wall was actually a small act. And he said, but we desperately need to break down the Berlin Wall between us and other species. Have you any thoughts on how we can do that? And can we ask ourselves what other species, what other animals want from humans?
I think I can tie that into what Lucy just said in her response to the previous question eventually. I'll try to be brief. That's a big question. The first thing that comes to mind from Moriarty's, or from his perspective, I guess, is when in the extract about his immersion in wild nature, when I was reading that, I was thinking about how, especially during the pandemic, when people have been doing more walks and maybe being outdoors a little bit more, I suppose the role of attention. So I might say, I went for a walk with my friends at the weekend in the mountains, and it was really nice. And what that is a kind of a surface level, I did a thing and I enjoyed it. But I wonder how many people go for walks in nature and they're in their own heads, or they're in their own thoughts, or if they're having a conversation with someone, or they're listening to something on their headphones, there's been a big attention suck away from the benefits that nature would bring them if they paid very close attention to it, and maybe even just stop walking, maybe just be somewhere in nature rather than kind of walk through nature. And I think what he did when he was having his experiences in nature was, at the very least, he was getting an extremely rich felt experience of nature that removed his ego as much as it's possible to remove an ego without, just dissolving into the ether. So if you can do that for a natural phenomenon like a river, like I said at the end of my presentation, I think there's no reason why you can't extend those principles to other species. And that that's why that idea of compassion, rather than being a kind of a sentiment or an emotion, can be action. And it's not, as Lucy said, it's not difficult, but it's a challenge to do it consistently because of the momentum of the lives we've been born into, that are kind of like, moving us along almost with momentum that's difficult to escape from on a daily basis. And if I could just briefly tie that off, one of the things I was thinking of again when Lucy was talking about awareness and action, and someone in the chat mentioned about the electric car thing, and I had thought of that again, the humility thing, because we don't necessarily know whether our solutions are going to end up in retrospect looking like another part of the problem. So I was just looking into the technology behind lithium-ion batteries recently for electric cars, and I was kind of thinking on the scale that there are going to be cars in the world, if there's going to be an extra 2 or 3 billion of us by 2050, it's kind of alarming what that will do to resources that considering what it takes to build a battery for an electric car, which then got me thinking of, so often we're looking for technological solutions to things. And one of the things that stops you doing is to focus again on your attention on your own perspective, your own reaction to things. I think, again, that happened during the pandemic, where as much as we're all relieved that there may be a successful vaccine, part of me worries that that's just a human reaction to say this terrible thing that was most likely human caused. Well, you know, we have technological solutions for that, so we'll be okay in the end. You know, some people will perish in the meantime, but we'll be okay. And what that does is it doesn't do anything to our collective questioning of what level of consumption led to our environment being encroached on so much in the first place that a virus escaped out into the human population. And then because we have planes, we're able to transmit it globally. Well, what were we getting on the planes for? You know, can we question, rather than, you know, can we question what our motives and what our conditioning does to us that causes us to act in the way we do, you know, on a daily basis and also across on the arc of a lifetime, rather than just kind of looking for technical or technological solutions all the time.
Thanks, Kevin. And I think also, like John Moriarty, he was strongly, well, he said that he believed that a lot of our technologies amplified human insanity. He actually said that. On the other hand, often in our society, every technological invention is seen as progress, and often to question a new technological invention is seen as almost being akin to being against gravity or something like that, even though it is just a human creation that is going to have some harmful effects and some benefits. This question came in from Sean Corcoran for Lucy. Can Lucy explain what is the backward step that she mentioned?
Sure, I'll certainly try. Can I just add one thing to the previous conversation about how we understand or think about things from the perspective of other species? And that today you can look in The Guardian, I think it was in The Guardian, a guy, I'm actually editing another book at the moment called Urgent Matters, which is about philosophy as a practice in response to the ecological emergency. Kevin, I'll tell you a bit more about it later. I'm one of the people who's contributing is called Paco Calvo, and he is a plant neuroscientist. Or I'm not sure if that's his exact title. I'm not sure if you can be a plant neuroscientist, but he's looking at at plant intelligence. And I think one thing that we can do is really support and look for. It's amazing what you can do when it's like learning a new word. You suddenly see it everywhere. You look for research into other species that focuses on what other species want, if you like, if you can put want in inverted commas, because we, you know, again, want is how humans understand things. So yeah, Paco Calvo's research is really interesting into plant intelligence. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to what other species need and want, and you know, there are a lot of philosophers, Mary Midgley, who have done research into that, and obviously Jane Goodall is famous for her research into chimpanzees and primates. So the other thing is the backward step, which, okay, the backward step. It's again, it's something which is really not that complicated. Right now, as you're sitting right now, if you begin to consider your own, just being here, just being where you are right now, then you are already taking the backward step. You've probably heard of mindfulness practices, and in a way, I can't stand the word mindfulness because, you know, it's been overused, and B, it suggests that your mind needs to be full. And I think that what you need to do is be able to see the mind, see what's going on in your mind from, well, yeah, maybe it is becoming a witness. It's looking at what's going on while it's going on, and it gives you a kind of meta view. It gives you it's like seeing things from a kind of seagull point of view. You can look at everything that's going on. You can look at why you're reacting in the way that you're reacting, and you can see it as almost as though you're looking at yourself from the outside. We don't need to help anybody else take the backward step. We can only do it for ourselves, and then do what I'm doing, you know, make a pig's ear of trying to explain it. But, you know, it's just another kind of failure, isn't it? You laugh at your own failures. You sort of, you keep, you do it through practice. So each time you breathe and you notice that you're breathing, in a way you're taking a backward step. Each time you catch yourself before you're triggered by somebody saying, you know, oh, you're looking fat today, you know, you stop yourself before you instantly react, and you give yourself that micro space, which allows you to let yourself attune to compassion and let the loving act happen through you.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So there was a question.
Take a breath, I will.
So I'll put these two together. John P. Milton, this is a recommendation, a teacher of something called The Way of Nature, teaches you to connect to nature and to listen with your whole body. His primary book, Sky Above, Earth Below, he combines Buddhist thought, Native American perspectives, and his own experience of connecting with nature over the past 70 years. And then another person recommended Roman Snarich's book, A Good Ancestor. We're all familiar with indigenous peoples, Native American people spoke about 7 generations and being a good ancestor. And John Moriarty was very strongly influenced also by the myths of indigenous people. Now, we know historically indigenous people have triggered extinctions in certain parts of the world, but also today, at this, even though indigenous people make up a small percentage of the world's population, the lands that they have rights to protect the vast majority of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on John Moriarty's influence by Native American myths and stories?
Yes, not in depth that I can think of at the moment, but one of the things that I think comes across quite strongly, and again, I think I don't know if Mary McGillicuddy is in attendance tonight, but she would have a better depth of knowledge than this on me. But one thing that I think comes across is, so Moriarty started out Catholic, renounced it, as we said, and you know, he baptized himself out of Christianity himself, and then returned to it eventually, not in a born again way. He said when he entered the Christian tradition again later in life, he said it was like it was for the first time. And his involvement, or his talk about Native American, or we call it maybe indigenous thought in America, and he was there and he met indigenous people, and he had communication and relationships with them. One of the things is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and this is coming back to the means end thing that Lucy mentioned, what you do on earth is kind of a means to where you end up, which is somewhere kind of metaphysically, you know, a heaven that is not here, that is not of this earth. Whereas indigenous traditions, not saying that they have conceptions of afterlife also, but they're a little more tied to land. They're a little more tied to, and their myths and their stories are a little more tied to the immediate. In the same way, I guess, that the Celtic tradition, which I'm trying to learn more about now, is there is the other world, which seems kind of mysterious and far away, but it's intimately connected to the land that is of here and now, and that we can learn a lot from that. And actually, talking about the species, you know, understanding other species, he tells a story from the if someone in the chat knows this and can correct me, I think was it the Blackfoot? I think it was the Dakota tribe, tell a story about how they basically, the very brief version is that they massacred buffaloes every year for their food. And then one year the buffalo kind of learned not to do this. And in this animistic way, one buffalo kind of entertains or he comes along with the idea that he'll marry the tribal leader's daughter in return for them giving up their meat every year. And this happens, and then eventually, the father wants his daughter back. So he goes and he tries to rescue her, and then the kind of leader buffalo gets angry and murders the father, and the daughter starts crying, and the buffalo says, "Oh, you weep. We didn't know that people weep." And it's a reversal of the human-animal dynamic, where we treat animals as produce a lot of the time, but then animals have feelings. What a surprise! And then the end of the story is basically this. It's quite magical and animistic, where the buffalo agree that they'll kind of dance. They'll live in equanimity with the people again, because they've suddenly realized that just as the buffalo themselves weep or feel suffering when their tribe are killed, they now understand that people feel suffering when their kind are killed. So in lessons like that, it's not very scientific or whatever, but the role of myth can engender a feeling of compassion between species as well by that understanding of suffering.
Thanks, Kevin. And one of the key points that John makes as well is that when we're isolated from other species, we also lose the medicine and learnings that other species carry. We're unable to access it, and we have this, he often talks about this loneliness of isolation, being isolated from other species. This question is, I agree, compassion and interconnected thinking is how we should evolve. Perhaps, Lucy, you can have a thought on this, but how to have these conversations beyond our silos, in particular building a critical mass toward agency to care for nature. Are you muted?
Just once. Okay, yeah. Now I'm unmuted. Okay, it's a great question. I would say that there are two things that we can do. The first is skillful communication. So if we're talking to people who disagree with us, who don't recognize, for instance, that there's an ecological emergency, then I think it's really important that rather than say, this is the whole point of the them and us thing, rather than say, you're wrong, the way to do it is to find common ground, find something, or understand what their position is, so that you can find a place to start a conversation. And in yoga terms, this is skill in action. It's not easy, but there are various tools that you can use. Nonviolent communication is a really good tool, and there's masses of stuff on the internet about that. I think it's important not to continuously inflame the situation by, while protesting is great and important, it needs to be very carefully done. If it's done in a way that creates violence, then all you're doing is increasing attitude polarization. So if you can't think of a way of communicating successfully, then pause, wait, and just learn about self-compassion. I always teach that there are three kinds of compassion. It's an artificial division, but compassion towards yourself is compassion towards other people, which is compassion towards the more than human world. When you're in a good relationship with yourself, you tend to not be so wasteful with goods, and you tend to be a better better able to have good relations. So communication. And the second thing is community. And community is building numbers. So it's what we're doing right now. This is a way of building community. So, you know, I don't know many of you, and I hope that you will get details about me, and that we will be able to communicate and create community. You create community by saying, you know, what interest do we have in common? And then you think, right, what could we do if we went for a walk? Would we be able to, in Cork, you know, maybe get together so that we can plant some trees somewhere? Does somebody know a councillor? You know, can we get together on plastic waste? Can we get together on, you know, so groups of people can get together? I mean, we are the people who are going to have to deal with this. So we need to create communities. Rather than pointing at others and saying they're doing it wrong, let's learn to do it right. So communication and creating community. And then hopefully the critical mass will happen. But then the end isn't important. Creating community is in itself important. Good communication is in itself important.
Thank you. So somebody else put in this comment, which is a nice way to end for the evening. Thich Nhat Hanh says, when we fall in love again with the earth, we will know what to do. And we need a collective awakening, that individuals do not awaken in isolation, but we need to awaken together in communities. And you can see, obviously, Thich Nhat Hanh, lots of his writings are available and his talks online. So I would like to thank again our two speakers, Kevin Power and Lucy Weir. Thank you very much for making your time available to join us this evening. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us this evening and participated in the event. Fridays for Earth will be happening on the second Friday of every month throughout the year. So we look forward to seeing you again at an event in the future. So take care and stay safe during this time.